Welcome and hello. How are you from the US? It's wonderful to see you. Lisa, thanks so much for being with us. So I am going to start off by asking the three of you for your, I suppose I'm going to ask you your why you do what you do, and then maybe just a little bit of an explanation of what you do and your businesses and your job, Lisa. So I might start with you, Lisa, if I may, from the States.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be with all of you today, and I'm so thrilled that we can do it this way, in a hybrid way. I know it's a lot to organize, but it's a demonstration of our agility and our ability to adapt in situations. So happy to be with you. And Anne, thank you so much. And Monica and Dee, I'm so thrilled we're having this conversation. But I spent a majority of my career on the business side in terms of running P&Ls and businesses. And in the last 3.5 years, I've been lucky enough to, I think, have one of the best jobs in the world, which is the people officer for Aon, with the realization that everything is about people and the ability to impact how we work together, how we show up, so that we can be our true authentic selves and be able to come through for our clients is so incredibly important to me. And never before did I ever think that, I would come into the role and that we would be hit by a pandemic shortly after I took the position. And it's been said often that chief people officers, chief CHROs are really chief uncertainty officers or chief pandemic officers, because we really are navigating through a time that we never have had to do before. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. I'm also fortunate enough to get to represent and lead the human capital solutions team at Aon. And so looking forward to talking about what we are doing, what solutions are out there to help each other. And again, Anne, just thank you for being here. But this is very near and dear to my heart. And I hope that we can bring some learnings to everyone today. And I'm sure I will learn quite a bit from Monica and Dee as well.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Monica, will I pass over to you to introduce yourself as well and tell us about why you do what you do?
Sure. Thank you. Good to see a lot of old friends. I should say friends of tenure. Perhaps we won't call them old friends. So I am founder of a company called Hatch Analytics, and Hatch is a human analytics and change consultancy, and we specialize in the future of work. And we come at it from the people point of view. So all of our consultants are master's level social scientists. So we really focus on what people need. And that's why I love the name of the event, Future Human, because when people ask me, well, what is the future of work? It is human. It will always be human. And I guess the why, the name Hatch comes from a quote by C.S. Lewis that I love that says, we cannot go on indefinitely being an ordinary, decent egg. We must be hatched or go bad. And that's really my mantra for living, in a sense, is that my why is to help people manage change in a way that is not terrifying, in a way that actually we can embrace and see the benefits of it, in particular existential change, which we have all been through. Of course, people have experience with that when they lose their job or lose their business or lose a loved one, but now we've seen it on a global level. And so that's really my why.
Dee, tell us a little bit about Boundless and then your own background and why you do what you do.
Sure. So Boundless is an international employment platform. We help companies that have international teams to handle HR compliance, payroll, taxation. And really what that enables is it enables companies, small and mid-sized companies, that might not otherwise have the resources to support cross-border or international teams. It helps them to grow those teams and find the best talent wherever they're based in the world. And in terms of why I do this, I spent 10 years in COO roles with B2B software companies, always had responsibility for HR, finance and legal. As Monica says, it's all about people. In the software and tech space, people are your by far and away your most valuable resource. There is no IP without the people. And I myself have lived in a number of different countries and saw that over time to attract and retain the best talent, really you needed to be supporting international teams. And we reached a point where, from a collaboration and communication perspective, international teams worked. But I myself firsthand felt the operational challenges of supporting that. So that's what led me to founding Boundless. So now, rather than tearing my hair out from time to time at how difficult this all is, I do it all day, every day.
Great idea. So, you know, we would have been talking pre-pandemic about, you know, the war for talent, and the war for talent, particularly when it comes to tech and innovation. Can I ask all three of you, where is it now? Where is the war for talent now, and how do you win it as an organisation now? I know it's a huge question, but whoever wants to take that first?
I'll jump in.
I'm happy.
The war for talent is well and truly back on, despite the fact that we're seeing huge layoffs at some of the tech organizations. Nonetheless, we are at a period of time where people, we talked about this, the three of us, people will vote with their feet. They have been given 2 years of maximum autonomy, for the most part, to be able to design their lives the way that suits them and their families the best. And they are now, I believe, in charge. We're seeing this with some of these organizations where people are simply saying, I will not go back. I won't go back 3 days. No, you can't have me. And the reality is that there now is a more, I believe, will be a more equal, a more equitable relationship between the employer and the employee, and that the employer can be very honest about what they need, and the employer can be honest about what they need, and either those things meet or they don't. And so I believe that now more than ever, employees are in charge.
Lisa, I think you were going to come into us there.
Which is, I couldn't agree more. And I know we talked about this before we met, but there's such an incredible amount of opportunity for us as employers to make sure that we are creating an environment for our colleagues that's focused on the entire colleague, the whole colleague. So when you think about well-being, when you think about resilience, when you think about emotional, mental health, physical health, employers have to take that into consideration with the decisions they're making in order to re-recruit the people that they have, and in order to attract people to come to their organization. At Aon, we've adopted something called smart working. So we're helping colleagues to identify what's the best way for them to be most effective. And we like to say it's not where you work, it's how you work and how you show up to be, again, your best self. And so this new opportunity for more of a voice from our colleagues that's balanced, I couldn't agree with more. It's critical, and it's the only way to win on talent.
Dee, your own experience?
So, I mean, you know, I eat, sleep and breathe the war for talent every day of the week, as much in terms of building out our own team as talking to customers that are dealing with these challenges. As Monica said, there's been a fundamental shift in culture. People have very different expectations now of work and their working lives versus prior to the pandemic. And, you know, we need to remember that the phrase, the Great Resignation, was actually only coined in May last year. It feels like, and we were living, you know, we were living with it before that, but the data in the US particularly, that was around the time we started to see this huge uptick in resignations. But Gartner released a report only 3 weeks ago, and they are now calling it a long-term situation, and they expect this to persist through the recession that is inevitably coming down the tracks. And what's been really notable about the shift in data just since Q1 this year is that it was millennials and Gen Zers that were handing in their notice before that, but the fastest growing group now are people that are in the 40 to mid-50s age bracket. And the Gartner research suggests that these people will continue to shift jobs. So on the employer side, you know, the advice is to overhire. Now, how practical that is during a time when it's so difficult to find the right talent, and when you're seeing people moving so quickly, and we are heading into a recession, you know, seems quite sure. Not always practical, but it does mean that leaders need to really plan ahead in terms of hiring and start hiring earlier than when you will need people. And if you are in a position to have a little bit of a buffer and perhaps overhire, that is the way to go.
And one of the other solutions besides overhiring is just looking at hiring in a totally different way, looking at what's called job crafting. So the idea that people can come in and say, I like this and this from the job, and create that, and then what's left over can go to a different person so that you get greater longevity. Or also hiring for skills clusters rather than for specific job description, so that as people, you want to hold on to them, you can switch them into other roles more effectively, but also skills clusters allows you to move them through other roles as those roles become redundant because of either business lines closing or because of technology. But that means like really being willing to give up a very traditional way of hiring.
And Lisa, are these things that, are these some of the things you're looking at Aon, for example?
I was just gonna add in, Monica, to what you said. It's career architecture. So it's really about figuring out how you build out careers for people, again, and look at all the opportunities that they have in a very different way. And that's how I think before we, even at Aon, we would talk about job architecture, and we would facilitate it towards a job. And now it's really holistically looking at the whole person, which I think is one of the gifts that came from the last 2 years, where we were forced to look for creative ways to address the workforce. And now again, with the war on talent, even more so.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we've been talking there a little bit about, you know, the people and our teams and all the rest of it in these companies and how you manage them. What about you know, they talk about managing the managers, but what about the leaders of organizations? Like, I'm very interested to hear from the three of you. Has that been challenging, getting, you know, leadership and management to really rethink how their work?
What do you think?
I'm not the expert. I'd love to know your experience.
Yes, the short answer is yes. It is difficult. It's been interesting to work with clients longitudinally and see those that were absolutely the world will end. I remember I had one client who said that the human race would stop existing if we didn't bring people into the offices, because the majority of people meet their partners at work. Ooh. And if they couldn't meet their partners at work, they'd stop procreating. This was her honest to God resistance. She is now a convert to a new way of working because she discovered she liked it. So selfishly, as people are discovering that it works for them and that businesses didn't collapse during this time, and in fact, some businesses are experiencing record profits right now. So obviously they look at the bottom line, that's still working. The business didn't fall down, that's still working. And so there is a shift. The problem is that there is still a fear about what the future will be, and when people are afraid, they go back to the way that they know. And so there is a bit of a knee-jerk right now saying, well, okay, it's not all the time, but it's 3 days. Well, 3 days is just a different yoke. So I think really it's getting people to accept that that is the past and we can't return to it.
Dee?
So I exist in a world where I spend a lot of time talking to people that run remote-first companies or that are thought leaders in the remote workspace. I do remind myself quite regularly that that's probably a bit of a bubble. But there is a marked difference in the organisations that have, and I don't mean embraced in a reactionary way. I mean the organisations, we founded Boundless about 6 months before COVID, and we founded it as a remote-first company. My co-founder lives in France. Our team are currently across 8 countries. We hire across, when we advertise roles, we're open to hiring currently from a list of 22 countries. So we, from day one, built processes and defined styles of communication and built a culture that was very much aligned with that way of working. There are now, you know, we tend to only hire people, or a large proportion of our workforce, certainly the leaders, are people that came from organisations that have worked that way for many years, that were working that way pre-pandemic. And we do ask when we interview people what the organisations they were at were like before the pandemic. So the type of leadership it takes to be effective in that type of organisation is very different to at an organisation that's perhaps hybrid. And for example, we look for people that are used to asynchronous communication, that are used to collaborating and doing long-range planning and running innovation workshops remotely. It's a real challenge for leaders that don't have those skills to try and adopt them. It's doable. Of course it's doable. We're all learning all the time. I didn't have these skills a few years ago. I've had to learn them. Many of my team have worked fully remotely far longer than I have. But there needs to be a willingness, right? I was willing. And I hired people that had far greater experience at that than I had. And, you know, I'm sure people working with people like Monica, they are seeking the answers to these things and they're seeking to learn. But leaders have to not only be open-minded to it, the most dangerous thing, and I always say when I'm interviewing people for roles, the people that say, oh, that won't be a problem for me, full stop. You know, people that are coming from a more corporate environment, we're a startup, when I say, what do you think are the challenges that you will have in this type of very different environment? When they say, I'll be absolutely fine. Red flag, red flag. It's the people that say, this is difficult. It is difficult. I find remote collaboration difficult. But what's really exciting is in a few years' time, we are going to have far more leaders that have developed great skills, but there is going to be this gulf between the organizations that have that style of leadership and the organizations that have the styles of leaders that say, I will tolerate remote 2 days a week. But of course, in those 2 days, we couldn't dream of doing anything collaborative. So all back into the office, and that's when we'll do our collaboration.
So Lisa, I know from talking to some of your own leaders at Aon, Lisa, that they kind of get this. So I'm hoping it's not too tough a job for you doing this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because, you know, 50,000 employees, it's much easier for us smaller companies we're fully remote, but it's so much easier for us to be agile. It must be a hell of a lot more challenging, Lisa, in a large, you know, established organization. I'd love to hear a bit more about that transition.
And the leadership piece is so critical in terms of what we're doing to provide them with skills that maybe they didn't have before. And I'll keep going back to the comment on what we're doing to help create a more resilient workforce, starting with more resilient leaders. So how are we providing them with skills that help them to create an inclusive environment? So a little bit bigger, but with larger firms, you're going to be in many situations like this where you have some people in the room and you have some people that are not in the room. And so how do you create me feeling included like I do today when I'm not in the room, but where I have just as equal of a voice as everyone else? What are the small things that you do when the video's off and people go to take a break? Little things like carrying the laptop around when you go to a breakout so that the person stays with you that's on video, like all these little things that we don't think about. But in terms of the specific skills, I think that we've really had to work on in all corporations and for all leaders, it really is for everyone. Home and work have collided. And so again, you have to be able to really understand the worldview of your colleagues, what matters to them, what's important to them, not just professionally, but personally too, in ways that we didn't have to do before. And it doesn't mean their deepest, darkest secrets, but it does mean understanding what their priorities are and being able to connect that. And more than anything, for every organization, understanding what the organization's purpose is and being able to connect that for the colleagues to what their purpose is so that they can see themselves inside the organization in ways that they didn't before, which requires leaders to really, really be focused on connecting to people's strengths and understanding what they are, but also understanding that we're all on this journey together and we're all developing and moving and changing. And then the last thing I'll say, because I'd be completely remiss if I didn't, is the conversation around well-being, mental wellness is at the forefront in ways that it never was before. I think the pandemic has given us this gift of the conversation has to be going on where we're providing the support to our colleagues for their well-being, for their mental wellness, which means going deeper with people and really understanding, again, what it is that will help them to be successful. You know, years ago, you could talk about, you know, your shoulder if you were going to have shoulder surgery, but you wouldn't talk about maybe if you were struggling with anxiety or depression. And today we really do need to be providing managers with the resources to be able to know how they can help support their colleagues.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you brought that up, Lisa, and I'd like to put it to you guys as well. You know, the whole issue of mental health after a 2+ year pandemic, you know, it's a whole different kind of support probably that's needed, A, and B, there's more of it possibly that's needed. Like, it has affected, I mean, I know a lot of people who it has affected deeply, you know, being on their own for so long, people who didn't have partners or didn't have family, who just were on their own even, you know, and didn't feel connected to work. Is it something that you're seeing yourselves? You know, I'm sure the answer is yes, but how are people handling that? You know, it's a big issue for managers and leaders, I think.
It's a huge issue. I think it was always an issue, but as Lisa says, the conversation wasn't open. All of us always had people on our teams that were struggling with their mental health, but they felt they needed to hide that. And I think there's a really good, we all notice it in even just our personal networks, how much more open people are about saying, I've had a bad few weeks, I've been struggling, things haven't been great. There's a really good opportunity for leaders to demonstrate empathy and to be vulnerable and to be open about how they're feeling. I think we've come a long way from an employee assistance program just being a checkbox that an organisation has, and having access to good mental health supports. In my view, it's a given. I mean, I think every and you know, anyone that is a leader, if you're from a smaller organisation and it's not something you provide, it is an astonishingly low cost. I won't call it a benefit, a low cost thing to provide to your team members. Personally, I think it's no matter what size your organisation is, you should be providing that. That's, you know, so base level. Beyond that, I think we really have to consider the reality of how people are working, and we talk a lot about how work needs to mould to people's lives, not the other way around, and that is probably even more important when it comes to people's mental health. So having flexible work practices, so at Boundless we operate full flexibility around work hours and how people get their work done. So the days of that dictatorial management style where the leader or the line manager would tell people what it was they needed to do, but also how they should do it, that now seems just so old-fashioned. And when we talk about people moving on from jobs, that style of management, there's nothing more likely to have people running out the door. But it's not, when we look to the future and think about the type of organisations and the type of cultures we need to be fostering, it is something quite different. And people need to have flexibility around where they do their work from, the hours that they work, and also around how they do that work. And people need to be trusted by their employers to feel that they're doing something where they are valued and where they can really bring value.
Yeah, I have a follow-on question, but I do want Monica just to tell us what your experience has been with your clients.
I think a lot of people are putting in place well-being programs, even well-being strategies, and frankly, the place just still sucks to work at it. So, you know, you can't slap this sticking plaster on a toxic work environment, and there are a lot of toxic work environments. You know, places that lay off 1,000 people on a Zoom call. You know, these places exist, and yet some of them have some of the most, on paper, robust well-being programs. But if you have a shitty boss and you're not allowed to work flexibly, and there, you know, and there's microaggressions and there's sexual harassment, and it is just a toxic pool of everything wrong with business, then your well-being program is meaningless. And in fact, it's worse than meaningless. It just smacks you in the face to say it's actually your responsibility to be better, to be well. And so I think that it's absolutely very important, but I'd like us to focus first, before we get into that, on the lower order elements, which is giving people autonomy, helping them discover their purpose and aligning it, like Lisa said, that connecting the purpose, and being very open about when those purposes don't align, how to have it be the best job they ever leave, and to welcome them back if that's appropriate. But I fear sometimes we focus too much on the well-being because it seems easy and we can just tick that box rather than actually creating healthy workplace cultures. And what is a culture? It's the wake you see behind a series of behaviors. And so it's every behavior you do points to whether you are a culture that supports well-being, not just a program that gets delivered.
Yeah. And I know, Lisa, I'm going to come back to you because I know from speaking to the likes of Eric that this is really key to Aon. Am I right? This is like part of a whole new people-centered strategy, that it not be lip service, the well-being side. Am I right?
It's interesting. I mean, even the way that I came into my job, I was the chief people officer, and I was the number one client of our human capital solutions team, because I was going to them constantly on, help me to figure out how we can get better at inclusion and diversity, help me to understand how we can create not checking the box, right? Where it's actually really about the culture and where we put the colleague at the center. And we really did center in on, we have to spend as much time focusing on colleagues as we do as clients, and putting that into everything we talk about. So how are people feeling more valued, more relevant, more connected? And it's not just words, it's through action, and it's through the things that we do. And then you can connect that to clients, right? So there's only two jobs. You're either helping clients or you're helping people that are helping clients, and helping each other. And so how do you constantly reinforce that, where you've got 50,000 people, or you've got 20,000 people, or you've got 10 people, and everyone, again, I think is able to show up and be their best selves? That requires a tremendous amount of strategy, work, follow through, and most importantly, passion and commitment to really, really caring about every single individual's success, and understanding that every single person, every single human being has a story and has something that they want to be connected to that's bigger than themselves. And it's our job as leaders to figure out how to do that.
Yeah. It is the one really cool thing that has come out of the pandemic, if there are silver linings in something so horrendous, is that whole self element, where we actually now know, what our bosses' little offices at home or their kitchen looks like, or it is kind of fascinating. There's no question about it. And I feel like I know a little bit more about the people I work with than I did. I really love that part. It's the one positive. I'm still going to come back to the challenges, because how do you, and I think, Monica, you said this right at the beginning, actually. You were talking about, the stats would suggest that productivity is not down. But how, some people are more challenged than others and are finding this harder. How do you ensure productivity when you don't have that contact? And I don't mean productivity in that old cliched sense. I mean that people are being productive and feel productive themselves, and they're getting sufficient feedback that's telling them they're being I'm not sure if that question makes sense. I hope it does, but can I start with you? You're nodding, so you know what I mean.
One of the key ways that we do this with our clients is we facilitate a session around what we call operating rhythms. And so this is one of the things that we've discovered. We know ourselves a lot better as workers now, because we weren't forced into the box of our manager or the structure of the organization. So we know our chronotypes. Many of us, know now what time of day we work best. There's been a huge increase in the number of people who've been diagnosed non-neurotypical or neurodiverse, because they realized that they were struggling in ways they didn't expect, and maybe sought some mental health support, and then discovered that they thought differently. And so just the recognition of how we work as individuals and being able to share that within a team structure, and then creating a social contract within that team that says, we will be physically co-located for these particular activities. We will be online, but we've got to see your face. This can just be dialed in. And you create a social contract with each other that says, this is how we'll hold each other accountable, rather than it being a top-down decision of, well, I've decided as a manager, this is how we're going to work. It really does require, or in our opinion, it works best if it's a collaborative effort, and then you take each of those teams' operating rhythms and cascade them up into the business, so that you start to have that sense of of a good workplace. What makes a good workplace? It's a place that is safe, effective, and familiar, right? At its very base. Well, what makes something effective and familiar is the knowledge that the stuff and the people will be where you need them to be. So there's nothing more frustrating than going into an office and then sitting on Zoom calls all day because no one's there. So it's really about having much more thoughtful conversations about how those operating rhythms work within your team.
And just to follow on from that, I mean, what about the people, just say they're already working with you. You know, I get the thing about hiring, you know, for a remote team, Dee, but what about the people in other organizations where they're already working there and they hate working from home? So, you know, I think they're outliers at this stage.
I don't like working from home. Don't tell anyone. It's a secret.
I think a lot of people know now, too.
Yeah. I love the office environment. I'm an extrovert. I love to have people around me. I like bouncing off people. That's my preferred way of working. However, if I was building the company that I'm building and I insisted everyone else was co-located with me because that was my preference, we wouldn't have access to the kind of talent that we have, and there are lots of reasons why it makes more sense for us not to be co-located. Sorry, I'm trying to remember exactly what your question was.
No. And I don't know if anybody has the answer to this, by the way. I'm not saying I do, for example. But what about the people who just really don't want to be? I mean, be all the time at home?
Hopefully what's come out of the pandemic is that there is variety in terms of what is available for people. And there are fully remote options, there are hybrid options, there are fully in-office options. And there are lots of options of all of those. Far more companies are in the middle rather than fully remote or fully back to the office. I think about 30% are fully back to the office now. 20-something% are fully remote. Everyone else is somewhere in the middle. So, and that's across all sectors. So people can find what it is that works for them as an individual. But I think even as a fully remote organisation, you have to find ways to foster connectivity across your team. So we do 3 times a year, we do an in-person retreat. We're off to Chamonix in France in 3 weeks' time.
Very nice.
We bring the whole company together. And that is where we do collaboration. We do a lot of our long-range planning. A lot of it is about ideation and our vision and where it is that we're going as an organisation, but also as teams. And we do a lot of social stuff. So in Chamonix, we'll be going hiking. We went to Lisbon in November and we went bike riding and sailing. And those moments are really, really important. You know, when you look at the monetary cost of doing this stuff, and then you look at the value that you drive from it. And it's not value that, you know, you can't argue that, well, if those people were in the office together all day, every day, you would get that same value. You wouldn't, because there is something magical and special about it being occasional. Yeah. And it's very intense when you're together for a week. You go deep on the thinking in a way that wouldn't be you know, you wouldn't do every day of the week if you were together. But you have to create those moments and you have to be intentional about it, and you have to consider the emotional aspects associated with how you've structured your team or how you've structured your environment, and you have to figure out the ways that will work for each of the people across all of the different personality types or preferences.
And Lisa, can you tell me a little bit about how you foster that connectivity at Aon?
Yeah, and I would just play off of Dee, what you just said, that in practice, it really does mean that you have to, as an organization, commit to new ways of measuring how people will be most efficient and effective. And it goes back to, again, their well-being, their psyche, their being their authentic selves, their best selves. And we really do, and I believe that we hired a Chief Wellbeing Officer, Rachel Fellows, who brought with her the Human Sustainability Index, which is really about educating and empowering us to understand how we are going to make meaningful changes, how we adapt to that, so that we can ultimately, again, help organizations to be their best. And that's what we've been doing at Aon, is constantly looking at where and how are we connecting on a mental, physical, emotional, relationship, purpose, community. How are we making sure that that whole part of a person is showing up? and doing that through data and analytics. So understanding through asking your employees constantly, surveys, looking out in the markets, but we're in such a learning mode right now and such a journey of understanding how, again, we make it the most impactful environment for the colleagues, and then in turn, that's where you can have amazing business results because you've got this engaged workforce.
Yeah. And I know we're running out of time, but I feel like we would be remiss to not reflect on the fact that almost every future of work conversation that anyone has is talking about knowledge workers. And the reality is the majority of people do not work in an office. The majority of people don't have these options. I had the opportunity to work for both Land O'Lakes and Cargill doing some work for them. These people slept on factory floors for months so that we ate. Literally, so that food ended up on our table. They were sleeping on the factory floor. And then we talk about whether we're going into the office or not. So I think we do have to remember that as office workers, many office workers are managing teams of people who are at the front, and that they also need to be part of the future of work conversation.
Yeah, we probably need to be a little bit more grown up about our complaining. It's funny, it was a big thing in Ireland as well during the you'll be aware of this, but during the pandemic, I mean, I honestly think that there was a newfound respect for retail workers and factory workers and warehouse workers that was not there before. So again, hopefully it's a good thing that has come out of it. I am going to have to wrap up. My gosh, that went so fast, and there's so many other things I could ask you about. This was a real experiment, and only that Lisa is such a pro, it really felt quite like you were here in the room with us, Lisa. Thank you so much. And I'm so grateful to Dee and Monica. Thanks a million, all three.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.